Hey everybody, what's going on? So today we're going to be talking about how we actually burn, or when we're actually going to be burning these macronutrients, these proteins, these carbs, and these fats while we're actually exercising. Kind of the strategy that we're going to take today is we're going to kind of kickstart with some figures, some charts, some tables, kind of get you guys seeing the big picture first, and then we'll go into some of the smaller aspects of it. Talk about the smaller aspects, pivot around a little bit, talk about how we use fat for fuel, and we're finished with about one or two slides on what protein is doing during all of this, right? So if you look here at this chart, you're going to see that we're actually going to be tracking the percentage of total energy yield coming from the anaerobic or aerobic system. So if we track with this red system, you can see that we're actually, as the time domain increases, as we continue exercising for longer and longer and longer periods of time, we're going to have a greater percentage of energy being yielded or coming from our aerobic system. So this is going to be that slower form of glycolysis into the Krebs cycle and into the electron transport chain that we've talked about before. If that yellow line, I hate that it's yellow instead of blue, I apologize, but that yellow line is going to show that we're actually going to be significantly decreasing, almost precipitously decreasing the percentage of energy yield that's going to be coming from our anaerobic system as we increase in time domain. So as we continue to exercise for longer and longer and longer and longer, that anaerobic percentage is going to dramatically decrease. And that's because we simply cannot sustain high work rates for long periods of time. Something I do want to point out and that I do want you guys to pay attention to is notice that neither one of those lines, either the red or the yellow, ever technically hit 0 or 100, right? They're asymptotic there. So that means that they're going to slowly approach and continually approach, but they're never going to actually touch it. So they end up being almost parallel. And what this is showing is that both energy systems are always running. It's just going to be the percent contribution that's coming in. For those of you guys that don't like graphs, I want you to take a look at the table. I don't do numbers. I hate numbers. So if we're looking here, you can actually see that during a 100-meter event, right? So a 100-meter sprint, really short duration, we're going to have a mixing of anaerobic systems. We're going to have phosphocreatine, that high punchy power, because it's going to last longer than 3 seconds. We're going to have some glycolysis in there. So we're going to be fueling some of that energy with glycogen. You can see that as the time domain of that event increases, as we increase the distance, the contribution of energy coming from anaerobic systems is going to dramatically decrease. So much so that as we keep going on, they start drawing dashed lines instead of zeros or whatever. It's not actually a zero. It's that the relative energy contribution is so overwhelmingly coming from the aerobic system that they're not even denoting the anaerobic system. Again, same thing, different way to look at it, right? So as we transition from rest to LME, or light moderate exercise, to high intensity sprinting exercise, to high intensity endurance exercise, you can see that the relative contributions of fuel from either protein, carbohydrates, or fat is also going to change. And well, why does this make sense? Well, the fats cannot be burned anaerobically, right? We have to burn fats aerobically. So it would make sense that as the intensity increases, our fat contribution is going to significantly decrease. That means that the only real fuel that we can rely on is going to be our sugars. So that's going to be our blood glucose and our glycogen, right? So the higher the intensity of the exercise, the greater the reliance on these carbohydrates and these sugars. The slower, the longer the intensity, the slonger, oh my God, the slonger. Make sure you remember it's slonger. The slower and longer type events are going to be relying more on our fat stores. That's kind of what we're now putting into words here, right? Whether movement is occurring or beginning at a fast or a slow speed, it doesn't really matter. We're going to have to start off with a level of immediate action, right? We're going to have some level of immediate ATP that's present as soon as we need it whenever we start exercising. Like if I were to stand up and then just go off for a jog, a nice jog with a short J, it would make sense that we need energy right then and there, right? Have my aerobic systems kind of spun up? No, not quite yet. So we have to rely on some of that uptick, that uptake is going to be coming from that anaerobic system. For really the duration of the day today, or this talk, I guess, this conversation, if you will, we're going to be talking and discussing really two major fuels. We're going to be talking about glycogen, and that's going to be really our major form of glucose. And then we're also going to be talking about triglycerides or free fatty acids, because that's going to be our source of fat as we're moving through and fueling our body during these long duration activities. So let's talk about carbohydrates. If we're going to be maintaining high levels of intense carbohydrate, we know that we're going to burn through those relatively fast, right? We're going to have to use those carbohydrates fast if we're going to be trying to produce energy fast. If you remember, we only have about 2,000 calories of stored carbohydrate inside of our system. So we need to make sure that we're having some level of availability of that carbohydrate ready to go. So as we start to increase from that lower to higher intensity, the liver is actually going to start shooting out glucose. It's going to start shuttling glucose out into the system. So it's going to actually start allowing us to be oxidizing or to start burning that fuel because it's being released. Because if it was held within the liver, we wouldn't be able to use it. Does that make sense? We have to have a release, or we have to have a mobilization of carbohydrate. The glycogen, that's the stored form of carbohydrate, has to be broken down and it has to be released. So we have to have some level of availability of that carbohydrate. What is it that's going to really be driving this? Well, it could be a couple of different things. It could be neural, right? It could be that there's humoral factors. So it could be these hormones that are being released. I don't need you guys right now to know that because it's a nutrition class. It's not a phys class. Another major thing is that it's going to be those levels of glucagon and insulin. So glucagon gets released when glucose is gone. When we have low blood glucose levels, glucagon gets released to try to increase the blood glucose level, try to increase the availability of that carbohydrate. So this is one hormone that's going to be released in big time. Insulin, on the other hand, insulin is going to be responsible for taking blood sugar from the blood and driving it into the cell. So insulin is associated with decreasing the blood sugar and helping to fuel our muscles during some of these activities. It would make sense that if insulin is high, then carbohydrates are high in the system. So we actually want to release more sugar when insulin gets low. Does that make sense? When insulin is low, that means that there's not high blood sugar. So when insulin is low, de facto, we have lower blood sugar. I just want to put an asterisk on that. That's not always the case. In individuals with type 1 diabetes, they fail to produce insulin, so that argument kind of is null and void. In those early kind of onset minutes of exercise, when we really need carbohydrate to be burning, it's actually going to be, I'm going to call it an anaerobic environment. It's not really an anaerobic environment because we have oxygen. It's just that the level that is needed of ATP is not quite there. So we're actually going to start burning through some of our stored muscle glycogen as soon as we start in that onset of exercise to get that energy right then and there. So what you can see here is that we're actually significantly increasing the amount of glucose uptake as the intensity of exercise increases. At first, this doesn't really, you're kind of like, what? That sounds a little bit weird, right? And this is a really cool procedure. Basically what they do is they take and they put a needle in the in the artery side of the leg and also in the venous side of the leg, so that as they can actually pump this labeled glucose in through the artery, it cycles down through the muscle and comes back out through the vein, so that we can actually infuse something into the artery and collect it out of the vein, and we can see how much of that radioactively labeled or that isotope has been collected inside the muscle. So as the intensity of exercise increases, the uptake of glucose increases. So this means that muscle is just sucking out as much of that glucose out of the blood as it possibly can, because it's trying to fuel that activity as much as it possibly can. Make sense? So what happens when we switch from that super high intensity, kind of punchy type exercise and go into more of a moderate or prolonged physical activity? This kind of quasi state. We're not quite going to be in that super low intensity like you're walking for 3 straight days, but we're also not going to be in this 100-meter dash type activity. As we continue to shift and as we continue to kind of decrease that intensity, continue into that submaximal level, we're going to start increasing the amount of lipid, the amount of fat that we're actually using for energy. So as that intensity starts to decrease, the timeline starts increasing, the lipid mobilization is going to start increasing, such that when we're in light to moderate physical activity, light to moderate exercise, fat is actually going to be making up the preponderance, the overarching majority of fat or of energy utilization. As we continue down this prolonged activity line, we're still going to be needing carbohydrates, right? Like just because fat is making up 55% of our, or even more of our energetic needs, we're still going to need some level of carbohydrate, right? 55% is not 100%. So as our body continues to use carbohydrate as we're exercising, and as we continue to sap our glycogen stores, and as we continue to use and suck on those glycogen stores, our body's going to actually start turning to that blood sugar. Now, if you go all the way back to the first couple of weeks we talked about, there's only a couple of tablespoons of blood sugar held within our body. It's not a really big energy reserve. And the problem is that the stored blood sugar is actually going to be super important for individuals that consume high-carb diets to be fueling the brain. And in a couple slides, we'll get into what bonking is, but essentially this is the primary driver of bonking. Right? It's going to be this decreased glucose availability for individuals that consume a high carbohydrate diet. And it's a very important distinction that we'll talk about in a little bit. So what is it? What is it that actually causes fat to be burned slower? Well, for just the sake of simplicity, fats can't enter into glycolysis, right? So since fats can't enter into glycolysis, we're actually a couple of steps back when it comes time to start making energy, because we have to start into the Krebs cycle. We have to make a couple of ATP for every couple of turns of the Krebs cycle, and then when we move into the electron transport chain, we get the energy payoff. But think about how many steps have to occur before we can get into the Krebs cycle, before we can get into the electron transport chain. It's significantly slower, right? So we have to actually move the fat from our adipose tissue or from our muscle. We have to transport it to the working tissue. We then have to get it into the muscle. We then have to make it from the muscle into the mitochondria. And then from the mitochondria, we have to start oxidizing it through Krebs cycle and through the electron transport chain. It's just a slower process. It's that simple, right? It's just got more steps and it's just a slower process. Something that really, I don't know why I'm like clicking around on a pencil. Something that really kind of drives the amount of fatty acid liberation, the amount of glucose availability, and the representation of fat burning is going to be how carb loaded or carb depleted an individual that consume carbohydrates is, right? Again, asterisk, individuals that consume carbohydrates habitually. It's a super important distinction because there is 2 different types of diets that athletes can follow: high carb, low fat, or low carb, high fat. We'll talk about it. If you look, so this pink line represents the carbohydrate depleted athlete, and the yellow line represents the carbohydrate loaded athlete, or the individual that has consumed high carbohydrates up until the time point of the activity or even during the activity. So as we track over here in panel A, this top left, you can actually see that the carbohydrate loaded athlete is able to maintain their plasma glucose levels. They're able to maintain their blood glucose levels. Whereas that is not necessarily true for the individuals that are carbohydrate depleted. If you look at panel B, top right, you can see that in general, we're not relying on fats hardly at all in the individual that's carbohydrate loaded, but we're relying on increasing amounts of fats in the individual that's carbohydrate depleted, right? In the bottom left, so this is plasma 3-hydroxybutyrate. Right? 3-hydroxybutyrate or beta-hydroxybutyrate is going to be the primary ketone molecule. And this primary ketone molecule is symbolic of elevated rates of fat burning. So this is the basis for the ketogenic diet, but it's also a very good proxy measure of how much fat burning is occurring inside of the body. If you look, you can see that this yellow line really stays relatively flat until about 60 to 80 minutes into the activity bout. Whereas in the individual that's carbohydrate depleted, from onset of exercise, we have a linear increase in the amount of fat that's being burned. We're trying to continually increase the amount of fat that's being burned so that we can maintain the energy output. And on panel D, you can see that with high carbohydrate fueling for the carbohydrate addicted or the carbohydrate adapted individual, you can actually maintain a significantly higher workload. Again, with an asterisk, this is only in individuals that habitually consume carbohydrates, right? If we were to have someone that habitually does not consume carbohydrates, the graphs might look different. This is, I can't not throw you guys a meme. Throw me a freaking meme here, right? Nutrient-related fatigue or bonking is really what's going to occur when those carbohydrate stores get really, really, really low. Anyone that's ever felt this knows how terrible it is. It's kind of like you're putting in all this effort and you feel like you're just running in mud. Central nervous system fatigue, you're kind of just like, why am I doing this? You start kind of getting sick of what you're doing. Might even be a major player in burnout during events. Just something to think about is this is going to be a primary regulator because of carbohydrate availability. So if you're working with a high carb athlete and they start to see this, you might need to put some carbohydrates into their system. Or if you're working with an individual that has a long training period ahead of them, they might need to be loading up on those carbohydrates going in so that they don't experience these acute performance decrements. All right, since we're moving right along, let's kind of keep hammering. We're about halfway through, right? So what would be one of the predominant overarching major, massive, super cool, however you want to describe it, training adaptations to really any type of training, but also specifically aerobic training, right? So one of the coolest things about aerobic training and the adaptations that come from it, really, I want to clarify, this comes from all types of training. We're going to actually increase the mitochondrial biogenesis. We're going to increase capillary density. So what does that mean? We're actually just going to start making a metric F ton, right? Four-letter word, ton of mitochondria. Our body starts creating mitochondria, increasing our ability to burn and make energy, burn fuel and make energy. It's one of the coolest things ever, right? It's called mitochondrial biogenesis. We're actually going to also increase our capillary density. So we're going to start the formation of brand new blood vessels. We're going to start breaking and branching off these blood vessels so that we can start driving blood and driving oxygen towards these more trained muscles. Now, what does that do exactly? Well, it's going to increase our ability to actually burn fuel, right? Because we're going to be using the Krebs cycle and electron transport chain, which are both located inside the mitochondria, we're able to significantly increase our ability to burn fuel. But it's also going to help maintain or increase our ability to maintain work outputs, right? It's one of the coolest training adaptations. If we're able to burn fuel at a faster rate and at a higher intensity, it would make sense that we're actually able to maintain a work rate for longer periods of time because we have the energy available for us. Now, this has two really neat side effects, right? One, it's going to significantly improve our ability to break down carbohydrates. So we're going to be able to get that real punchy type energy. But do you think that this is only good for burning carbohydrate? No, right? Like for every increase in mitochondria, we're going to significantly and dramatically increase our ability to burn fat. Fat can only ever be burned within the mitochondria. So every time we add, let's say we go from 1 mitochondria to 2 mitochondria, we just doubled our ability to burn fat. So that means that we're going to be able to push back that timeline in which we need to start using carbohydrate. The longer we can rely on that fat store, the longer we can stave off the carbohydrate utilization, and the longer we can kind of stave off that bonking or that low glucose availability time frame, right? Does that make sense? We're trying to bolster our fat burning capabilities so that we can minimize our carbohydrate needs so that we can exercise at higher work rates for longer. it is super important to note that there is a biological difference in substrate use during physical activity for both men and women. Women are going to generally burn significantly more fat and be better fat burners than men. This is probably due to a hormonal response, mainly a change in the sympathetic and parasympathetic nervous system, major differences in stress activation of fat burning between men and women. But there is definitely a difference. Women tend to be able to burn significantly more fat during activity than men. Since this is a nutrition class, we need to talk about diet. And at this point, I hope that some logic would prevail, even though I know that logic is dying in this day and age. I hope some logic would prevail. If glycogen is the stored form of carbohydrate, then we need to consume really high levels of carbohydrate to store really high levels of carbohydrate, right? We need to consume high levels of carbohydrate to store high levels of carbohydrate. We can't eat high levels of protein and store high levels of carbohydrate, or we can't eat high levels of fat and store just massive high levels of carbohydrate. We need to eat high carbohydrate to have high carbohydrate availability. So if you look at this blue dot right bang on in the center of this chart, you'll see that it's about a midpoint for an individual that's consuming a normal diet. However, if we shift to the right, if we start looking at a high carb, low fat diet, individuals that are just pounding carbohydrates in, they're going to have significantly longer times to exhaustion because they don't have they're able to maintain their carbohydrate availability for longer, right? On the other side, if you short-term give an individual a high-fat, low-carbohydrate diet, then they're going to struggle with maintaining high levels of exercise. I will make an argument against this picture though, right? A hot dog on a bun and French fries is not a high-fat, low-carb diet. That's blasphemous. It's crazy. But if you short-term acutely give an individual a high-fat, low-carbohydrate diet to an individual that is habitually adapted to consuming carbohydrates, they're going to struggle with their exercise timelines. They're not going to be able to maintain work output, and they're going to stop and they're going to fatigue earlier, right? Individuals that are habitually consuming a high-carb diet are going to struggle when you switch them over to a low-carb diet. Guaranteed, right? It's going to happen. The timeline of that needs to change in order to see differences. Right. So we've talked a lot about carbohydrate. Let's talk a little bit about fat. What exactly happens with fat use during exercise? Well, as we change in physical activity levels, we're going to be changing the relative contribution of that fat burning. So there's really going to be a couple of major sites that we're going to be pulling that fat from. The first one is going to be fatty acids coming from triglyceride storage sites and adipocytes, adipocytes, whatever you want to say. It's going to be the cleavage of fat stores, right? Like whatever's around our belly and our butts and our arms, if you got teacher arms, then that's going to be what's helping to fuel some of this exercise. That's one site. Second site is going to be the LDL that's going to be circulating throughout the body, right? We're going to be able to pull triglycerides off of that LDL that's circulating throughout the body. If you remember a couple weeks ago, we talked about these LDL, and what I wanted you to remember is that all that it represents is fuel availability. That's exactly what we're talking about here. As we're pulling those fats off of the LDLs, we're able to use them for fuel. And then we're also going to have stored fats, stored triglycerides, muscle adipose tissue, or muscle fats stored within the muscle that we can use for fuel. Interesting little caveat side note, competitive swimmers actually exhibit extremely high levels of intramuscular fat. They have high levels. It's almost an adaptation that comes with swimming. As far as I'm aware, there's not a really good, clean answer to why this happens, but we think that it has to do with an insulation as well as the availability of the fat storage for energy, because you got to think, they're not breathing on every single muscle contraction, whereas like a runner has constant availability of oxygen, swimmers don't have constant availability of that oxygen. Kind of an interesting, I have no idea what's going on. It's just an interesting kind of side note to have in there. So what's causing this lipid to actually be released? What's causing it to actually be driven out of storage and into the blood so that we can then use it? A series of hormones. So we're going to have hormone-sensitive lipase. Anytime you see the word lipase, it means it's responsible for breaking down fats. And this is going to be released in response to epinephrine, norepinephrine, and glucagon. Epinephrine and norepinephrine, those are sympathetic fight or flight type hormones. Glucagon is going to be released whenever we have low glucose availability. So we're saying, oh man, we need energy, and we need energy now, right? We're in an energy crisis because we have low blood sugar, glucagon, and we just got punched in the face. So we need to be able to fight for our life or run for our life right now. Another really cool hormone that's kind of a part of a super family of hormones is growth hormone. It's going to be extremely responsible for burning fat. Typically growth hormones associated with like gains, right? Like gains with a Z, but it's also going to be highly important in our ability to burn fat. So in the first kind of hour of activity, right, in that first short time where we still have high levels of glucose availability, we're going to be using about 50% fat. As that time domain increases, as we take and we stretch that time period out well past an hour, we're going to go towards, we're like 70, 80-ish% burning fat. Like we're going to dramatically increase our fat burning in order to maintain that work rate, in order to maintain energy availability. Really kind of a cool concept here. So that's exactly what we're looking at here, right? As we start at rest, you can see that really we're not even measuring anything. We move over to 40 minutes of activity, and you can see that blood glucose is making up about a quarter of energy availability and quarter of energy production. We've got 40% fueling coming from fat, 35% coming from stored glycogen. As we move over to 90 minutes, 180 minutes, and 240 minutes to 3 hours, right? 60, 120, 180. 4 hours. I'm an idiot. As we significantly move over, as we start to increase that time domain, we dramatically increase our ability to burn fat. That fat burning is just crazy high, right? It's kind of a cool adaptation. But the big thing to pay attention to is that it has to do with intensity. It's driven by intensity. So at lower intensities or moderate intensities, we're going to be getting a majority of our energy from our fat. But as we start changing the intensity, as we start increasing the intensity range, we're going to start changing what fuel source we're relying on. So if we increase our intensity, we're going to be driving from carbohydrates. As we decrease our intensity, we're going to be driving from fats. Just really important concepts here. Clearly, this is going to be an important thing because I've said it like 150 times. If you look at this graph, you can probably explain why this happens, right? If you look at this, it is technically a graph, bar chart, right? If you look at this figure, you can explain why this probably happens already based off of what we talked about. Why would untrained and trained individuals have significant differences in their availability or their ability to burn fats? And why can they actually burn higher levels of energy or burn higher levels of macronutrients to get greater levels of energy? Mitochondrial biogenesis. That's right. And that increased capillary density. So because we're able to not just drive fuel towards the active tissue to a greater ability, we're actually able to significantly increase the rate at which we can burn it and increase our availability to burn that fuel. So we actually are significantly fat adapted with training alone. Kind of a cool concept, right? So now we're going to get into a little bit of some nuanced or kind of contemporary research. So this is what most of my PhD focused on, actually all of my PhD and doctoral work focused on, and this is really an area that I strongly and passionately believe in, and that's the use of low carbohydrate diets for athletes. So the first major place that it makes sense to use a low carbohydrate, high fat diet in is ultra endurance athletes because their intensity of activity is extremely low. While they might be running for 14 to 48 hours, their intensity level is not very high, right? They're not working at a super high intensity. So this is just an example of a couple of athletes that are currently low carb that have not just broken but shattered both national and international records when it comes to ultra endurance events. These aren't the only ones. There's hundreds and thousands of these athletes. We actually flew a guy in from Siberia that was in the Air Force just to complete in this next study that I'm about to show you. It's pervasive. The low carb movement is massive right now, and it's really kind of a cool thing to watch. It wasn't just my group that was really focused on it, and my group is this top left one. There's other individuals all across the country and all across the world that are kind of coming to the same conclusion as well. So Tim Noakes is one of the best running coaches of all times. He's one of the best marathon coaches of all times. He actually developed type 2 diabetes as a result of consuming such high carbohydrates that were recommended with a marathon type diet. And this is a guy named Sami Ikanen. If anyone gets bored and you want to watch a really cool documentary, he has a movie called Serial Killers, spelled Cereal, kind of like grains and cereals. Fantastic movie. It's about him and his wife who row from California to Hawaii unassisted. So they literally hop in a rowboat and row across the Pacific Ocean. Crazy, crazy, crazy. Really cool athletes, amazing athletes. Really interesting story too. It's not just ultra endurance running. It's not just kind of like these ultra endurance events, right? Cyclists are also making the switch. So this is Chris Froome, probably the most successful, if not the most successful, one of the most successful cyclists of all time, is a low carb, high fat diet. Incredible individual. New Zealand All Blacks, the Columbus Crew, so professional soccer teams and professional rugby teams are making the switch from high carb to low carb because they don't feel that they actually need all the carbohydrates that are recommended for them in a day, right? Crazy to think that these teams are literally taking and flipping the guidelines on their head. So what does the science look like? So this is a study that came out of my group. They were at Connecticut at the time, but we ended up transitioning to Ohio State. We brought in the top 10% of all, really it wasn't 10%, I don't know why I said that, it was the top 1% of all ultra endurance athletes. Every single individual that was taking part in the study held either a national or an international record of some level in an ultra endurance event. And each one of them had competed for their country in an international style event. Really neat group of athletes to work with. We had two sets of individuals, one that was habitually adapted to a high carbohydrate diet, one that was habitually adapted to a low carbohydrate diet. They were on these diets for a period of time, at least a year, and really they did a good job. These were validated by registered dietitians. They had multiple check-ins before they came in. Really just a good group here. You can see this mask is attached and affixed to this man's face. This mask is actually going to be measuring oxygen and carbon dioxide levels so that we can get an estimate of how much fat or how much carbohydrate they're burning based on how much CO2 they're producing. Here's another athlete with the mask on. You can see we did a series of blood draws, and then we also did a series of muscle biopsies. So muscle biopsy means that we basically go in and we cut out with a really big needle that's about the size of my pencil, cut out about an eraser size worth of muscle out of their quadricep, so we can do stuff like measure the amount of glycogen that's inside of the tissue, how much fat, all that type of stuff. Really kind of a cool study. So what did we find? Well, we found that the individuals that are adapted to a low carbohydrate diet, the individuals that don't habitually consume carbohydrates, were dramatically better at burning fat. So all the way across the exercise bout that we had them do, which is a 3-hour treadmill run, they actually doubled the amount of fat that was burned. So they were able to produce significantly more energy from fat. They also were able to produce significantly more energy from fat for significantly longer. They were able to average dramatically higher intensities with dramatically higher fat. So because these athletes were so mitochondrially dense, because their capillaries were so pervasive, because they were able to drive so much fuel into their muscle, they were actually able to exercise at significantly higher intensities with almost exclusively fat burning. So what that means is they were able to stave off using their stored carbohydrate, so they didn't have to rely on carbohydrate, so they weren't at risk of bonking. Right? Again, just more of the same, dramatically higher levels of fat burning. This is something that's never been shown before. They were able to also significantly increase their ketones. Unrelated to anything that we're talking about, they had significantly elevated ketones because they were actually on a ketogenic diet. They were keto adapted. They'd been on this ketogenic diet for a long period of time. If you remember earlier, I said that a low carb, high fat diet in short term durations is going to actually hamper performance. 100% true. That happens for everybody. These athletes had been on the diet for so long that they had actually come back and kind of super compensated. They actually were able to get past where they were before. Kind of a neat concept. Glycerol means that they had significantly higher levels of fat mobilization occurring, which makes sense because they were burning really high levels of fat. Now, the really cool, super unexpected finding is that glycogen levels were mirrors of each other. So our high carb athletes and our low carb athletes started with the exact same amount of glycogen, burned the exact same amount of glycogen, and resynthesized the exact same amount of glycogen. So glycogen utilization was no different. This means that both sets of athletes were able to hold on to and use the correct amount of carbohydrates. So despite the fact that those high-fat guys weren't using or consuming carbohydrates, they were able to use them and tap into them the same way that the high-carb athletes were. And what's really cool is the rate of resynthesis, their ability to go from all the way down here back up, was the exact same. So they were actually, despite not consuming carbohydrates, they were able to make carbohydrates from non-carbohydrate energy sources. That's a really cool finding. So in general, this is just a list. I'm not going to test you on the benefits of keto, but it's something that you need to be aware of is out there. It's something that you need to know is available for athletes that might not respond well to high carbohydrate feedings. If you have athletes that are struggling, if you have a family member that's struggling with kind of their glucose tolerance, their ability to maintain energy, their ability to not have periods of kind of like downtrodden times throughout the day where they're in an energy stress or an energy crisis, this could be a potential alternative. It needs to be done correctly. It needs to be done well. It's not just what's found on social media. We'll talk about it later on in the semester about what a good quality keto diet looks like. But for now, I want you to know that it is an option. It's not the devil, right? It is a very good option. It's not the devil. All right, last slide. What happens with protein during exercise? Well, hopefully not a whole bunch, right? The goal that we want to try to have is we want to not use protein during exercise as much as possible. The more we're able to not use protein, the better it is for our muscles. If we have to go in and start using protein for fuel, we're going to start breaking down our tissues. When we start breaking down our tissues, it starts leading to really negative side effects, right? You start losing force, you start losing strength, you start eating away at your muscle mass, literally. So it's something that we want to actually limit the amount of fueling that's coming from it. And we want to make sure that we are eating enough so that we can maintain that safe little buffer. Generally, the RDA is set so that the average individual doesn't have to worry about tapping into their protein stores during exercise. But the individual that is an athlete or is a resistance training athlete or a long distance runner needs to consume more protein than the RDA, not just a little bit, but dramatically more protein, up to about 2 grams per pound or per kilogram of body weight. So that roughly equates to about a gram per pound of body weight, because there's so much energy stress, there's so much mechanical stress and mechanical trauma occurring to the muscle that they actually have to significantly increase the amount of protein that they're consuming. All right, gang. Macro use during exercise. Get it, got it, good. That's kind of like Jocko-y. Good. Or, I don't know what just happened.